The rain outside tapped lightly against the taxi's windows as Emma Claire clutched her worn canvas bag tighter to her chest. She stared at the tall gates looming ahead, black iron wrapped in ivy, guarding a world far beyond anything she had ever known. Her heart pounded so loudly she was afraid the driver could hear it. Her fingers trembled as they fumbled for the envelope in her lap, the one with her name on it in crisp, dark ink. Inside, a contract. One she never imagined signing, Emma had. Always lived quietly, a small-town girl with soft hands and softer dreams. She spent her days helping her grandmother, who had grown more frail with each passing month. The hospital bills came like tidal waves, swallowing every penny they had. She'd applied for jobs, begged for scholarships, prayed for miracles. But in the end, what arrived wasn't mercy, it was a man's offer. Damien Blackwood. His name carried a certain chill when spoken. Whispers followed it like smoke. Ruthless, powerful, untouchable. A man who built empires and buried his past. He was twice her age, infinitely wealthier, and utterly unreachable. And yet, he had sent a lawyer to her doorstep with a proposal that made her blood run cold. Marry me. Stay 1 year. No intimacy unless you ask for it. Emma had stared at the words for hours. She thought of her grandmother lying weak in that hospital bed, of the nurse gently shaking her head, of the insurance they no longer had. The money Damien offered could cover everything, every treatment, every second chance. So she signed. Now, standing before his mansion's grand entrance, Emma's knees felt weak beneath her. The door opened before she could knock. A butler greeted her with a nod, taking her bag. His voice was kind but distant. He's waiting in the study. Emma walked through the marble halls, every step echoing louder than her breath. The air inside the house was warm but heavy, like the silence had settled deep into the walls. Portraits stared down at her. Chandeliers glittered above, but nothing felt alive. The door to the study was already ajar. She stepped inside and saw him. Damien Blackwood stood near the window, his back to her, dressed in black slacks and a simple buttoned shirt. No tie. His posture was casual, yet unnervingly still. When he turned, his eyes met hers, blue, sharp, and unreadable. His face was chiseled, his jaw tense, but there was no malice in his gaze. Only quiet, controlled curiosity. Emma's breath caught. She expected coldness, dominance, maybe even arrogance. But Damien said nothing at first. He watched her. Like a man claiming a prize, but like someone studying a fragile creature who might bolt if he moved too quickly. Finally, he spoke. His voice was deep, steady. "You're smaller than I imagined." Emma's lips parted, unsure if it was a compliment or something else. She gripped the strap of her dress tighter, but braver, he added. "You came. I didn't have a choice," she whispered. "You did," he replied softly, walking toward her slowly. "But I'm glad you made it." Emma flinched slightly as he approached, not from fear of him, but fear of what she'd become by saying yes to this arrangement. Damien stopped, just a step away, close enough that she could smell the clean, smoky scent of his cologne. But he didn't reach for her, didn't touch her at all. Instead, he said gently, "You have nothing to fear from me." His words weren't hollow. They held something she didn't expect, restraint. Emma blinked. The room swayed. Something in her chest twisted, confused. Damien Blackwood wasn't what she imagined. Not yet. But as he turned back toward the window, his shoulders tense, she realized something else. There was a sadness in him, and a silence that felt like it was hiding something much bigger than either of them. And somewhere deep inside her, where all the warnings and instincts lived. She wondered what it was he wasn't telling her. Emma awoke to soft golden light spilling across. The guest room floor, the curtains fluttered slightly in the breeze, and for a moment she forgot where she was until she turned her head and saw the high vaulted ceiling, the carved ivory bedposts, the untouched tray of breakfast. Sitting quietly near the window, it all came rushing back, the contract, the mansion, the man. Named Damien Blackwood, who had spoken so softly and yet carried something dangerous behind. His eyes had barely slept, her thoughts had twisted and turned through the night, wrapping around the memory of his voice, the stillness of his presence, The weight of her decision, she had thought signing the paper would be the hardest part, but now she realized the true difficulty lay in breathing. Beneath a roof built by silence and secrets, knock on the door was gentle, yet it echoed like thunder. Through the room, Emma froze, her heart leaping into her throat as the door opened. Slowly revealing a woman in a gray dress and tightly pinned hair, she looked like she had never smiled in her life. "Breakfast is getting cold," she said, "simply Mr. Blackwood expects you in the conservatory." Emma nodded, swallowing the tight knot of nerves in her throat. As she slid out of bed, the floor was cool against her bare feet as she crossed the room to where the simple cream dress had been laid out by someone. While she slept, the fabric was soft, too soft, like something that belonged to another life. She slipped it on and stepped into the hallway, her hands trembling as she followed the scent of roses and would polish toward the conservatory. Damien sat at the far end of a long glass room, bathed in morning sunlight, his profile sharp against the backdrop of hanging ivy and stone statues. He did not rise when she entered, but his gaze lifted and locked with hers, and again, that stillness, that unreadable silence settled between them like a third presence who slept. He said, his voice smooth, not quite a question, not quite a statement. Emma nodded. "Yes, thank you." Gestured to the chair across from him. "Tea." She hesitated before nodding, and he poured a cup without a word, sliding it toward her with careful precision, his fingers never brushing hers. The space between them felt electric, filled with things unspoken, filled with the tension of a man and woman bound by paper, but not yet by choisetto. "You like music?" he asked suddenly, his gaze never leaving hers. She answered softly, surprised by the question. "I used to play the piano when I was little." His eyes flickered, but not with amusement, with something else. Memory, perhaps regret. He used to play too, he said, then rose from his seat and crossed the room to the grand piano tucked near the archway. His fingers hovered over the keys, but did not press them. "Instead," he said, "she was the only one who ever asked me to stop playing, not because it was bad, but because it reminded her of things she didn't want to." Falima watched him, his back straight, his hands still. She could feel it then, the ghost of someone who had once lived here, a woman who still lived in the corners of his silence, and perhaps in the locked west wing she had seen from the hallway. "You don't have to explain," she whispered, but he turned slowly, his expression unreadable, and yet his eyes burned with something quiet and fierce and old. "I know I don't have to. But maybe I want." Tosh stared at him, unsure of how to respond, and then he said something that caught her off guard completely. "I won't ask you to pretend not to see the shadows in this house or in me. I'm not a man who offers Lee Sema's chest." Tightened, her fingers curled around the handle of the teacup, but it was no longer about warmth, comfort. It was about steadying herself against the realization that this man, this stranger, this billionaire wasn't made of stone, he was made of scar sand. She didn't know what was more terrifying, the idea that he might want her, or that he might never let her close enough to see. Slowly, unsure why her legs were moving, unsure why her voice spoke without permission. "I don't want your money for this year," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I only want my grandmother to live, and when this ends, I want to remember that I was still me, not someone who disappeared into your silence for a moment." The only sound was the faint chirping of birds beyond the glass. Damien turned his head slightly, as if considering her words, measuring them, weighing them, before finally he nodded once slowly and said, "Then I promise to protect your name, your soul, and your fire, even if I never get to touch them." Mima didn't speak again. She couldn't, not after hearing something that sounded so much like a vow, and yet not a single feeling was simple anymore. Not fear, not safety, not even the awareness that her heartbeat had begun to echo. Hisk left the room before she could fall deeper into the quiet between them, but as she closed the door behind her, she realized she had forgotten to ask him the one thing that haunted her more than anything else. Well, was the woman in the locked wing? And why did she look exactly like Emmeth? Rain came without warning, a sudden downpour that draped the Blackwood estate in a curtain of silver. Emma stood by the window of the drawing room, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the world Outside vanish in the storm, her reflection stared back at her pale, wide-eyed, dressed in soft silk that felt too rich for someone like her, the tea. In her hands had long since gone cold, but she hadn't noticed her thoughts were elsewhere swirling. As violently as the clouds overhead's door opened quietly behind her, and she didn't need to turn to know it. It was him, Damien. His presence filled the room without sound. His steps never rushed, never hesitant. He moved like a man who controlled. Time itself, his voice broke, the silence low and smooth. You're awake. Early Emma didn't look at him, not yet. She couldn't, not after last night, not after the way he had spoken about shadows and silence, not after the way her heart had raced when he promised to protect her soul without ever asking for it in return. I couldn't sleep, she whispered. The storm woke me, or maybe it wasn't the storm. Maybe it was the weight of everything pressing down on her ribs like a secret that refused to stay. Barry Dumian walked to the other side of the room and lit the fireplace. The flames crackled alive, casting golden light across the floor, and for a moment he stood there, staring into the fire as if searching for something he had lost long ago. His profile was sharp, carved and cold, but there was weariness in the way his shoulders sank, like he carried a memory he couldn't put down. She'd finally turned to face him, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't control or calculation. It was distance, and maybe even pain. You look like her, he said suddenly, his words slicing the quiet like a blade. Emma blinked, confused, like who didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the room toward a cabinet she hadn't noticed before, hidden behind an old curtain. He unlocked it with a silver key that hung around his neck, and when the doors creaked open, the room shifted as though the very air held its breath inside. Were photographs, old and faded, black and white, some sepia, some torn at the corners. They were all of one woman. Beautiful, haunting her eyes, too familiar for comfort. Her face, too much like Emma's to be coincidence. Her name was Elise. Damien said quietly. She was supposed to be my wife. Emma's breath caught the room, tilted for a moment, and she had to steady herself against the window frame. What happened to her? Damien didn't answer right away. He closed the cabinet, locked it again, and tucked the key beneath his shirt. She died the night before our wedding. She was gone before I could say goodbye. And I've been haunted by silence ever since. Emma swallowed hard. The firelight danced in his eyes, making them glow with something fierce and distant. I'm not her, she said, her voice soft but certain. No, Damien replied, his gaze locked on hers. But sometimes when you walk through these halls, I forget. Thought. A long silence stretched between them before Damien turned away and walked to the window, standing just inches from her. He didn't touch her, but she felt him. Their warm, solid thunder cracked in the distance, and lightning flashed, lighting up the glass, and for a brief second their reflections merged, two figures blurred by storm and fire. Emma looked up at him, her voice trembling. Then why did you choose me, Damien? Why ask a stranger to marry you? Why? May his eyes met hers, and for once there was no armor, no mask, no distance. Just a raw, quiet truth I needed. Untouched by this world, someone who didn't come for power or inheritance or secrets, someone who reminded me of what I used to believe. Einand, you thought I'd just agree, she whispered, stunned. You thought I'd just give up my life and say yes, no, he said quietly. I didn't think you would, but you did, and I still don't understand why. Beckos. I had no choice. She snapped, but even as she said it, something inside her twisted, because that wasn't the whole truth. Not anymore. Not after the way he looked at her, like he wanted to shield her from everything, even himself. Didn't want you to feel trapped, he said softly. That's why I added the rule, no intimacy unless you ask for it. I didn't want to become another man who took from you without giving something. Bakima turned away, her eyes burning. She couldn't understand him, couldn't understand how someone so cold could speak with such unexpected kindness. But maybe that was the most dangerous thing of all at her that night, when the storm had calmed and the halls were quiet. Again, Emma passed by the west wing. Once more the doors were still locked, but this time she saw it clearly, a faint light glowing beneath the crack. A shadow moved. Just once, as if someone was still in there watching, waiting, and Emma realized then that not every ghost wears a white dress. Some live behind locked doors, and some live inside the hearts of men who never stopped grieving and didn't know which one. Damien Blackwood was, but she was certain. Nosha had stepped into something far deeper than she had ever imagined, and it was only just beginning. World outside had changed overnight. The rain had left behind a stillness too deep, too quiet, as if the sky itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to break through the silence. The morning light bled slowly into the Blackwood estate, turning the marble floors to gold and the heavy curtains to flame, and Emma stood in the center of it, barefoot, robe clutched tight around her as the silence pressed into her bone, hadn't slept again. The memory of Damien's voice had followed her into her dreams, those photos, the woman in them, the locked cabinet, the shadow behind the west wing. It all clung to her like a second skin. Questions scratched at her throat, things unsaid, things unseen, things hiding behind the way.
Ow.
Damien looked at her with both distance and intensity, and yet she didn't runch. Wandered the mansion as, searching for something she hadn't yet named, she found herself standing in front of the west wing once more, its doors tall and unmoving, carved with a rose motif that looked too delicate for a man like Damien, and still the keyhole remained untouched, daring her to try and open what was never meant to be opened. But the sound of footsteps behind her made her turn sharply. Damien stood there, dressed in black, his expression unreadable, his voice quiet. "You shouldn't be here." Emma stepped back, shame tightening her throat. "I'm sorry. I couldn't sleep." "And the door's there locked for a reason," he said, and for the first time his tone held something sharp, something that hinted at pain turned to steel. "You said you didn't want lies," she whispered, "and I don't want to be another thing you hide from us." Expression flickered, then softened as he looked away, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, sadder. "I'm not hiding from you, Emma. I'm protecting you from what's in there. Oh, think I'm too fragileno," he said, "too important." Then, without warning, he reached into his pocket and held something out to her, a small silver key, delicate and cold in his palm. "This opens the west wing," he said, his voice controlled. "I'm not asking you to use it, but if you ever decide you need the truth more and safety, then you'll have Itima." Stared at the key, but didn't take it. Her heart was beating too fast, her hands too unsure. She looked up at him, and for a moment it was like standing on the edge of a cliff and seeing the ocean crash below. "Beautiful, terrifying, endless seem. Not ready," she whispered. "Eddie." "No," Damien said, and closed his hand, slowly curling the key back into his fist and placing it back into his coat pocket. The offer stand turned to leave, but paused at the end of the hall and said something so soft she almost missed it. "I'm not the man you think I am, and that might be the very reason you're still Saphathy." The rest of the day moved slowly like water over glass. Everything felt heavier after that. Her thoughts, her steps, even her breath. She caught glimpses of Damien in distant corridors, always alone, always walking, as if chased by something invisible, and always disappearing before she could speak. It was nearly midnight when the phone call came. Shrill, sharp, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Emma rushed to answer, expecting only bad news, because what other kind of news came at that hour? But it wasn't the hospital, it was a voice she didn't recognize, cold mail clipped and full of controls. "Stay away from him," the voice said, and hung up before she could speak. Emma stood frozen, the receiver pressed to her ear long after the line had gone dead. Her skin prickled with dread, her mind racing, because that voice hadn't been random. It hadn't been a mistake. It had known who she was and who she was with. Stumbled through the hallway, trying to find Damien, trying to breathe, but the mansion seemed to stretch endlessly with every turn until she found him in the garden, alone beneath the moonlight, cigarette between his fingers and eyes distant as the stars turned as she approached, and before he could speak she asked, "Who are you really, Damien? Who wants me gona?" His gaze didn't flinch, but something in him cracked just slightly. His voice was low as he said, "There are people who think marrying you was my mistake, Weebus. You're not part of their world, Emma. You weren't meant to be dragged into this, and yet I brought you." Her throat tightened, her fists clenched. "You didn't drag me, Damien. I walked in. I chose this. Even if I didn't know what I was choose." Ingi looked at her then, and there was something raw in his gaze. Like a wound that had never healed, his fingers twitched as if he wanted to reach for her, but didn't. Instead, he said, "Then let me protect you the way I couldn't protect Harima." Stepped back, her voice breaking. "Who was she, Damien? Tell me the truth." But he only looked up at the moon and whispered, "Someone I failed Wind picked up, the leaves rustled, and for a heartbeat Emma saw it. Again, the loneliness etched into his silhouette, the grief that wrapped around his frame like a cloak, and the dangerous quiet of a man who had given everything and still lost. Suddenly she didn't know if she should stay or run, but either way. She knew this was no longer just a girl with a contraction. Was the storm inside a story that had barely begun to unravel. The morning after the call was heavy with fog. The mansion seemed to breathe with it, the windows clouded, the walls muffled, and the lights so dim it felt like the sun had forgotten how to rise. Emma sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the door. With wide, unblinking eyes, her fingers curled tightly around the hem of her nightgown. The phone's silence echoed louder than any ring ever could. She had not slept, not even for a moment. The stranger's voice kept playing in her head, low, threatening. Stripped of humanity, like ice pressed against the back of her neck, stay away from him. Words refused to leave her. When she finally stepped into the hallway, the air felt thicker than usual, as if the mansion itself was warning her. She didn't see Damien, but she felt him everywhere. His scent lingered in the tapestries, his presence breathed from every wall, like the house belonged to him so completely it had taken on his silent J. Wandered without direction until she reached the ballroom, a space she had never dared to enter before. The doors were wide open, as if inviting her or daring her to step into the echoes of a past too large to fit in a single. Emma walked inside slowly, her footsteps tapping lightly against the polished marble floor. The chandeliers above were dimmed, the walls lined with mirrors, so tall they made her feel like she was being watched by dozens of versions of herself, all uncertain, all unprepared. And then she saw Ida piano sitting alone in the corner, dustless, untouched, perfectly in place, like something sacred or haunted. Moved toward it, drawn like a moth to flame, her fingers hovered over the keys without pressing them the last time. She had seen Damien near a piano. He had refused to play. And now here it sat like a ghost in the room. She pressed one key. It rang out clear but hollow, like a bell in a forgotten church. And before she could strike another note, she heard the voice behind her she used to play. That Tuma turned slowly. Damien stood in the doorway, dressed in black as always, his eyes darker than the room, his posture still but dangerous, like a man waiting for something to fall apart. Was she? Emma asked again, her voice no longer soft, no longer afraid. I deserve to know. Damien walked forward slowly, his gaze fixed on the piano. She was my fiancée, Elise. She died the night before our wedding. The police said it was an accident, but I know it wasn't. Emma's breath caught, something cold spilled down her spine. Not an accident, then? Watch was pushed, Damien said flatly. Her body found at the bottom of the cliff behind this estate, and no matter what I said, no matter what evidence I brought, they called it misadventure, said she slipped, said no one had reason to harm her. Bet you know, but Terry knows she was scared in the days leading up to her death, she told me. She felt watched. She got calls, notes, warnings, and then she was gone. Nema's voice trembled. Someone wanted her gone, and now someone's calling. Damien's eyes locked with hers, and for the first time, his mask shattered. Completely. You think I haven't noticed the change, Emma, the way you flinch at shadows, the way your eyes scan the room, like you're waiting for something to lunge from. The dark stepped closer, and his voice dropped so low it was barely a whisper. I was a fool once. I believed love could protect someone. Now I know. Better stared up at him, her heart breaking for him, for her, for herself. Damien, I'm not Elisino, he said, but they think you. Those words hit like a wave. They knocked the breath from her lungs. They blurred everything, because suddenly this wasn't just grief, this was danger, and she was standing in the middle of it. Blindly. Think I'm her, she whispered, her voice hollow. Why? Because you look like her, Damien said, and because you're wearing the ring. I gave her. Rima's hand flew to her finger, the engagement ring, simple, elegant, and too large for someone like her. She hadn't noticed before, not really, but now it burned against her skin, as if it had always belonged to someone else. We didn't you tell me because I thought I could protect you, because I didn't want to scare you away, because I was selfish and wanted a second chance to do it right. Stepped back, tears threatening the edges of her eyes. You didn't just marry me for the contract, no, he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice. I married you because when I saw you, something in me believed in life. Again, because I saw her ghost but felt your soul, and I knew. They weren't the Samima's legs gave out, and she sank onto the piano bench. The weight of everything pressing down until she could barely hold her head up, Damien knelt before her. His hands gentle on her knees, his voice shaking as he said, I won't lose someone again, not like that, not like her, so if you want to leave, do it now while you still can, but... She didn't want to leave, not anymore, not even with the threats, the danger. The ghosts that crept through the halls at night, something kept her rooted. Something deeper than fear reached out and took his hand, her voice trembling but firm. No more secrets, Damien, not between us. If I'm staying, I want all of it, the truth. The past, the shadows, everything looked up at her, his expression stunned like he hadn't expected her to stay, and then slowly he nodded, one word passing his lips like a promise everything danged. Behind them, the wind howled through the open window. As if something outside had been listening all along, sky turned darker than it should have. At that hour the clouds hung low over the Blackwood. A state like bruises stretched across the heavens, heavy with something more than rain in beneath. Them inside the mansion, a storm of another kind had begun. Emma stood in the dim hallway, her fingers still curled tightly around the cold, weight of Damien's old engagement ring, as if it might whisper something to her, something to explain why. Everything around her felt like a lie dressed in velvet silence had changed. No longer still now. It was sharp now. It bit with unseen teeth.
Ow.
Now every creak of the floor sounded like a warning, every gust of wind rattling the windows felt like. A breath too close to heavy to deliberate had asked for the truth, and Damien had promised it now the time. He'd come to step fully into. If met her in the east wing, his sleeves rolled back, his jaw tight, as if he were bracing for a confession. That would tear something loose from both of them. Emma expected him to speak first, but he didn't. Instead, he handed her the key. The silver won the one to the west wing and nodded once, only once, and then turned away as if afraid to watch what it would do to her. Stood before the locked doors again, her breath uneven, the key trembling in her grip. Then she slid it into the lock, and the sound it made as it turned was not a click, but a sigh, like the house itself had been waiting through him. Beyond was nothing like the rest of the mansion, no marble, no chandeliers, no polished glass, only dust and forgotten time. A bedroom frozen in sorrow, pale blue curtains untouched, a vanity still holding a brush with strands of hair that had not moved. In years, and on the wall above the fireplace, a large portrait of Elissima stared into her face. The resemblance was more than haunting, it was cruel. They could have been sisters. They could have been mirrors, and yet something in Elisa's eyes was different, colder, darker, like she had known too much too. Young, like she had already guessed how her story would end. Emma turned away, unable to hold that gaze for long, her skin prickling with the sense that she was no longer alone, and when she opened the wardrobe, she found the letter stacked in a leather box, tied with a black ribbon each. Envelope addressed to Damien, each written in the same looping hand, and as she read the first lines, her blood turned colds, watching May he knows. I know we think he'll do it. Sunima dropped the letter, her heart slamming against her ribs because those words weren't just fear, they were a profesu. It shouldn't be an Harethi voice behind her was not Damien, but older, deeper, colder she. Spun around, breath caught in her throat, and saw the butler James standing in the doorway. His expression unchanged, but his eyes now gleamed with something unfamiliar, something sharpy. Was told to stay out of this room, she said, trying to keep her voice steadies, and for good reason. Stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, and the door behind him swung shut. The click of it locking felt like thunder. What happened to her? Emma asked, her voice cracking. James tilted his head. She asked too many questions. Too loudly. You were the one who called me, weren't you? You're the voice on the phony. Didn't answer, just smiled slightly and reached into his coat for something small, black and metal assume. Don't belong here, Emma, he said softly, not in his world, not in this house, and certainly not in her shadow bear. He could move further. The door behind him exploded open. Damien burst in his face, pale with fury, his hands clenched into fists, and when he saw the object in James's hand, he didn't hesitate. Helangetti's struggle was short but brutal. Damien fought like a man who had waited years to strike back, and when James finally hit the floor unconscious, Damien stood over him, chest heaving, eyes burning as he turned to Emery Hirsch. Shook her head, tears streaming down her face, the letter still crushed in her fist. He was going to do it again, she whispered. Wasn't Hedamine, nodded slowly. I always suspected, but I could never prove it, till Noemma's knees buckled and Damien caught her before she fell, his arms wrapped around her as she sobbed into his chest. And through it all, the portrait of Elise watched from the wall, silent, unmoving, but somehow, at peace. He was the one, she whispered. He pushed Heres. You were going to protect me from Hemizba. It was more than that, she realized. More than guilt, more than memory. Damien hadn't just feared for her life. He had feared for his heart, because falling for her meant risking that pain again, that loss. Again, that haunting again, and he had already lived through it. Onsima looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her voice hoarse. I'm not her. I'll never be. Harry. No, Damien said, and his voice broke, and you're the only reason I survived. Losing Herond in that moment, Emma understood that love was never quiet, not really. It was the scream inside silence. The fire beneath ash, and as Damien held her tighter, his hands trembling, his eyes closed against the storm still breaking around. Them she knew, this wasn't the end of their storythis, was the moment it truly began. The ambulance lights faded into the fog beyond the gates, and the silence that followed was not peace, it was aftermath. It was realization. It was everything unsaid. Collapsing into everything undeniable, Emma stood at the top of the marble staircase, her fingers still curled around the banister, her skin cold. Her pulse racing as if her body had not yet caught up to the truth. James, the man who had served the Blackwood House for over a decade, had been arrested for attempted murder and suspected homicide, and yet that wasn't the part that made her knees weak. It was Damien's way he had thrown himself between her and danger, the way he had held her afterward. Like he was terrified to let go, like if he blinked she might vanish into the shadows like Elise had Doneth. Found her hours later sitting by the fountain in the courtyard. The sky above them burned in hues of orange and crimson as the sun dipped. Lower and lower, and he stood there for a long moment watching her without speaking, his hands in his coat pockets, his shoulders tight. Didn't look at him when she spoke. I keep thinking about the night you found her. His voice when it came was rough from disuse and grief. I found her at the bottom of the cliffs. Her dress was torn, her hand was still holding the note she'd meant to give. Muhata did it say how she was scared, that she loved me, that she wished she'd run. Sunarima turned slowly, and their eyes met. The ache between them was thick enough to touch. She's gone, because he thought she didn't belong, gunned, so he tried. Again, Damien whispered, because you looked like her, because you touched the same piano, because he thought history could be rewritten with one more bod. Yama's throat burned, and you thought you could keep me safe by pretending this wasn't happening to me, and closed his eyes for a long breath, and then crossed the space between them, kneeling before her. So their faces were level, so his voice could tremble without shame. I thought if I kept you at a distance, if I buried the past deep enough, the ghosts would stay quiet, but they never do. They just reached up her fingers, brushing the edge of his cheek where the worry lines had deepened, where the fear had etched itself in silence, and for a moment he leaned into her touch like a man who hadn't known comfort in Yersi. Didn't fall in love with a ghost, Damien, I fell in love with the man who watched me from across a ballroom and never demanded anything more than my presence, who stood between me and a monster without blinking. Gave me his mansion and asked for nothing. In return you gave me your fear and your silence. And still I stayed back as I wanted to, Damien said, his voice cracking, because somewhere in the middle of pretending this marriage was just a contract, I started wishing it wasn't. Temma's breath hitched, and her voice dropped to a whisper then. Stop pretending? It blinked, and she leaned in, pressing her forehead against his, their breaths mingling their hearts. Caught in a rhythm that felt dangerously close to real. I don't want to be your escape anymore, Damien. I want to be your choyeo. Arethan Saith swallowed hard, his hands lifting to cradle her face, his thumb brushing the tear she hadn't noticed spill down her cheek, and then he whispered so quietly she almost missed. I do love you. Emeth's words trembled in the air, and then Roach didn't speak, not right away. Instead, she kissed him not with urgency but with reverence, with gratitude, with the ache of someone who had waited too long to be chosen, and as his arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, grounding her, anchoring her, everything else began to fall away. He didn't speak of Elise again, not that night, not as the sky darkened fully and the stars blinked into view, not as he led her back inside the mansion and paused just before her bedroom door, his hand lingering against the polished wood, his gaze searching hers for doubt. There was no Nesh. Stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "I want you to stay." Damien's breath caught, and he whispered, "You don't owe me anything. This isn't about owing you. This is about needing you. And maybe I'm scared to, but not enough to keep pretending I don't know what this ish." Opened the door slowly, the room bathed in candlelight shadows dancing across the floor, and when she took his hand and led him inside, it wasn't with hesitation, it was with intent, it was with trust. Stood before her, his jaw tense, his eyes searching, and she reached up slowly, undoing the buttons of his shirt. One by one, her fingers shaking slightly as skin gave way to scars and strength, and the quiet history of a man who had built walls just to survive. When his shirt hit the floor and she stood before him, bare of doubt, she whispered, "I'm not here because of the contract. I'm here because this heart won't let me be anywhere else." And when he kissed her, it wasn't careful anymore. It was full of everything he'd been holding back. Every memory, every fear, every desire cloaked in silence, until now their hands tangled, their breath quickened, and when he laid her down, it was not as a man claiming what was his, but as someone offering everything he wasn't. When their bodies met, it was not about pleasure, it was about healing, and in that quiet, beautiful fire they burned away everything that had once kept them appertanned. When the dawn broke, neither of them slept. Becca's love had finally arrived, and it refused to be quiet anymore. Morning came like a whisper, wrapped in gold and breathless stillness. The Blackwood estate stood bathed in warm light, as if the mansion itself had exhaled for the first time in years, as if the walls had finally surrendered the ghosts they had been holding for too long, and inside that silence, a pair of hearts beat in unison, tangled beneath linen and sunlight. Emma lay with her head against Damien's chest, her fingers tracing the faint scar near his collarbone, the one he had never explained, and maybe never would, but somehow she didn't need the story to understand its weight. It was there, in his breath and the way his arm curled protectively around her, even in sleep, as though some part of him still feared waking to find her gonish. Closed her eyes, her lips brushing lightly against his skin, and for the first time since the contract was signed, since she stepped foot into this world of secrets and silence, she felt something unshakable beneath her ribs. Peace, not loud, not triumphant, but quiet, steady. Earned, but peace is never the end. It is the breath between battles, and the first sign of the next storm came not with thunder, but with papra letters sealed in black, arrived by hand, delivered to the estate gates with no return. Addressed no courier, just a stranger in a dark coat who left before anyone could speak. And when Damien unfolded the letter, his hands turned cold, his jaw tightening as his eyes scanned the Pagama. Watched him from across the breakfast table, her smile fading. Damien, "What is UIT?" didn't answer right away. Just folded the letter slowly, his hands deliberate, his face unreadable, but the stillness in his body was the same stillness she had seen the night James had turned violent. The stillness of a man calculating survey value being summoned. He finally said, "By the board of Blackwood International." Emma blinked, confused, summoned. "Why, I'm not even part of your business, Sue." "Are now," he said quietly, "since I signed over 30% of the company to you last weeker." Chair scraped against the floor as she stood slowly, her heart thudding. "Damien, you didn't tell May. Didn't want you to worry. I wanted you to have power if something ever happened to Mezamething, like James something." Where Seema's breath caught, her fingers clutching the edge of the table. "Damien, what are you not saying?" Looked up at her, and in his eyes was not fear, but the kind of calm that came when a man had already made peace with war, someone inside the company. Someone powerful. They want control again. They don't like what I did. They think I've gone soft. Since you are a Vidima, took a step closer, her voice shaking. Then tell them you're still the man who built this empirus. Smile was faint and hollow. That's the problem, I don't want to be that man anymore. At afternoon they arrived at the Blackwood International Tower, a building of glass and steel that scraped the sky. Itself, Damien's hand never left hers as they entered the elevator, his grip steady as the numbers blinked. Upward each floor, a reminder of the empire he had built. And the people who now waited to tear it apart. They entered the boardroom to find 12 men and women seated in a perfect circle, their eyes sharp, their mouths thin, the tension immediate.
Oh.
One of them, a man with silver hair and a voice like poison, spoke first. We thought you'd come alone. Dominima lifted her chin, but Damien answered. First, she's not just my wife, she's my partner, and you'll address her as such. There were murmurs, but no one challenged him directly. Instead, the silver-haired man slid a folder across the table. The contents are clear, Damien. Since your marriage, your decisions have been erratic, reckless, emotionally transferred assets. Made unapproved investments, weakened your own position, and now you bring her into the SEMA. Felt the heat rise in her chest. The sting of accusation, the implication that she was a disease in Damien's world, something dangerous, something unworthy. But Damien's voice cut through the room like a blade. If any of you had ever truly built something from nothing, you'd know the difference between protecting what you own and controlling what you fear. His gaze swept over them, cold, ruthless, and for a moment Emma saw the man they used to fear, the man who once walked through fire and left ashes behind them. The silver-haired man leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. Your past will catch up to you. Damien had always dosed words hung heavy, and when they left the building, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something old and patient. That night she wandered the halls. Unable to sleep, she paused at the west wing, where the door remained open now, the air inside lighter and yet still touched by shadows, and as she stepped inside, she found something new. A note slid under the door, a single line written in red ink begged. Uterun Tuma's hands trembled, and when she turned, Damien was standing behind her, his face pale, his eyes dark with a fury she hadn't seen before. Not done, he said. And now they're coming for you, Touche. Reached for him, but he caught her wrist gently, his voice shaking. I won't lose you, Emma. Not like her, not Aganthon. Don't fight this alone, she whispered. Not this timid. In that moment, they both knew the war had just begun, and the price of love was no longer silence. It was survival. Sky cracked open that night with no lightning, no thunder, only the sound of secrets unraveling like seams in a fabric too worn to hold together anymore. The Blackwood State stood tall but tense, wrapped in a silence that no longer felt like protection, but warning. Damien stood at the window, his silhouette outlined in the moonlight, his back straight, his hands clenched behind him like he was waiting for something to strike. Emma watched him from the doorway, her heart heavy, her pulse too loud in her ears. She had seen him many ways, soft, thoughtful, broken, angry, but never like this. Never as the man preparing to lose everything. The letter had changed everything, not just the words, but the timing, the cruelty of it. The handwriting matched the old letters from Elise, the ones she had found in the wardrobe, the ones that had never reached him. It wasn't just a threat, it was a message from someone who knew how to wound him, and now they were coming again. This time not with warnings, but with strategy, and Selenstically going to attack through the company. Damien said, his voice low. The board will try to call a vote by the end of the week. They'll say, I'm unstable, unfit. They'll try to force a sale of the remaining shares. They'll isolate you, corner you, and when they think you're alone, they'll take more than the company. Emma stepped into the room, her bare feet silent against the polished floors. Then don't let them. Turned, his eyes fierce but tired. And what would you have me do? Burn down everything I built just to keep you, Safino? She said quietly, just stop pretending you're alone in this. You gave me power, remember, so let me use. Eth looked at her for a long moment, and then something in him finally broke. Not in weakness, but surrender, the kind that comes when you finally realize the person beside you is not a burden but a shield. Next morning, the papers hit every major outlet, headlines blazing across the screens. Blackwood heiress speaks, Damien Blackwood's wife takes control in surprise press conference. Emma had done it. She had stood in front of flashing lights and whispered truths that no one expected, and yet everyone hard thee. Think I'm too quiet, too young, too soft. But maybe that's what this company needed. Someone who listens, someone who watches, someone who knows what it feels like to be underestimated behind the cameras, behind the glass. Damien had watched her not with control, not with pride, but with awe, because in that moment he saw what they all refused to see. Not a girl, not a contract, not a stand-in for a ghost. He saw a woman who had already walked through fire and chosen to stay, and now she was burning a path for him too. But the applause hadn't even died before the call came, this time not from a stranger, but from a private number. Damien answered before the first ring finished, and the voice on the other end was not just cold, it was familiar. Rue. We made her a target, the man said. You always did have a weakness for broken things. Damien's jaw tightened. Who are you? Already know, the voice said, and then the line went dead, stood frozen. The phone in his hand, the world narrowing around him as pieces slid into place, memories, voices, footsteps, faces from the past, one in particular, one he thought buried under years of silence. When he walked into the study, Emma was already there, sorting through old documents, trying to find any thread they could use to hold back the storm. But she looked up the second he stepped in, and she knew. How was it? She asked a friend. Of my father's, Damien said slowly. One who was supposed to be Didama stood slowly, her breath catching Damien. I need you to tell me everything now. And so he did, not all of it, but enough. A story of legacy built on blood, a father who taught power with cruelty and buried enemies with a smile, a mentor who turned rival and vanished the night before Elise died, a man who once said love makes men weak and then proved it with silence. He was at the cliff that night. Damien whispered, I didn't see him, but I feel it now. I remember headlights, a shadow near the trees. Elise said someone followed her. I didn't. Listanima moved to him, her hands on his chest, grounding him. Damien, it wasn't your fault. But he shook his head, his voice cracking. It doesn't matter. They'll use her death. They'll use your presence. They'll twist the story until the world believes I'm a threat to everything I tried to build. Then let them, she said fiercely, because you have something they don't, and never will. What meaned as the storm rolled over the hills, as lightning flashed distant across the sky. Emma pulled him closer, lips near his ear, and whispered, let them.
Oh.
Come, because this time, Damien, we're not running, we're not breaking, and we are not alone. And when their lips met, it wasn't sweet or soft. It was armor. It was promise. It was the kiss of two people who had lost everything before and now would lose nothing without a fight. And far away from the estate, a man in a black car watched the footage of Emma's speech, his fingers tapping against the dashboard, his eyes sharp, his smile thin, and when he turned to his driver, he said, prepare the jet Beckos if you want to break a man like Damien Blackwood. You don't go after his company, you go after his heart. And now they were coming for both. The storm did not wait for midnight. It arrived early, without mercy, no warning, no knock, just wind tearing through the hills and thunder splitting the sky like the earth itself was opening to spill out every secret Damien had buried for years. And he, inside the Blackwood estate, the walls no longer felt like sanctuary. It pulsed like veins of a living beast, ready to fight, ready to bleed, ready to protect. And Emma stood in the center of it all, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the shadows had started to move. She had not worn silk tonight. She had not braided her hair or waited by the window like a woman holding on to hope. She wore black from throat to heel, her hair loose, her hands steady, and her voice, when she finally spoke, was the voice of a woman who had walked through fire and now stood on ash. There, coming for more than your name now, Damien. They're coming for your Sewell. Looked up from the folder on his desk, his shirt sleeves rolled back, his tie loosened, his face carved from stone, but his eyes burned the way they had the night he first told her the truth. I know, Kadruna, we can't. Not this time. Then we face them together. Crossed the room in 2 long strides, his hand reaching for hers, not to guide her, not to shelter her, but to hold her like an equal, like the fire beside his own. And for a moment, just a moment, the storm outside seemed to pause, as if watching thee. Came in black cars, no plates, no markings, engines that whispered instead of roared. The gates had not been opened. They had been bypassed because these men did not ask permission. They took what they believed was. Oedema stood at the top of the grand staircase, Damien beside her, and when the doors below burst open and the man in the dark coat stepped inside, it was not a stranger, not an enemy, not a ghost. It was someone Damien had once called familiar uncle, Adrianthe. Name left Damien's mouth like poison, like betrayal. Always were too soft, Adrianque said, walking slowly his coat. Trailing behind him, his smile wide and hollow and venomous. You let that girl in and thought you could rewrite. What our family stands for are not a family anymore, Damien said, and this house is no longer yours to inveterains. Eyes shifted to Emma, and for a moment his smile faded. You look just like her. Emma held his gaze unflinching. I am not Elisino, Adrian said softly, but you are the last thing standing between him and what he fears Mistimas. Voice did not break, and what's that freedom end? Then it began not with violence, but with silence, the kind that presses against the walls, the kind that shatters without sound, the kind that comes when power meets its reflection. Adrian reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope, throwing it at Damien's feet. Court orders, board signatures, a legal coup painted in ink and legality. We voted Damien, you're out not. Yedima stepped forward, her hand lifting, and from her own coat she pulled a matching envelope. Thicker, heavier, final. You forgot one thing, she said. What's that shares Damien gave me make me the largest single owner in the company, and I vote to remove you. Adrian blinked, his jaw tightening, and before he could speak, Damien stepped forward. Voice low and lethal, you underestimated her like you underestimated me, and that's always been your greatest. Flabat. Adrian was not done. He smiled again, this time darker, colder. And what about the truth, Damien? About the woman you failed about? The secrets buried beneath this very housey. Never buried Elise, Damien said, his voice rising. She was taken from me by a man who called himself Bloodema, stepped to his side and took his hand, not just in love, not just in solidarity, but as a weapon. And if you try to take anything else from him, Adrian, I will burn your legacy to the ground. Silence that followed was different this time. It was not fear, it was respect, it was recognition. It was the quiet that comes when the battle has been decided. Without a single gun fired, Adrian turned slowly, his eyes narrow but beaten, and when he walked out the doors did not slam. They whispered shut like the wind had changed. Gerseth. Next morning the papers told a different story, one of legacy. Reborn of empires, reforged of a woman who had come from nowhere and rebuilt the name Blackwood from ashes, but inside the mansion none of that Mataridama and Damien sat beneath the garden's willow tree, the one Elise used to paint, the one Damien had refused to cut down, and between them silence again, but now it was P.C. Turned to her slowly, his fingers brushing hers. Do you regret any of it? Shook her head. I only regret not choosing myself sooner. You did choose yourself, Damien said quietly, when you chose Mesh. Looked at him, and for the first time in all their days together, her heart did not tremble with uncertainty. It beat with purpose, with clarity, with truth. Choose me again, she said, not as a shield, not as a contract, but as your future. A reached into his coat and pulled out a ring, not the one that had belonged to Elise, not the one that had started their story, but a new one, simple, pure, meant only for Harema. Claire Blackwood, will you marry me again? Not for survival, not for inheritance, not for war, but for love. Her answer came with no hesitation, no doubt, only fiery sand. Beneath the tree that had once known loss to hearts, finally learned how to live beyond, the storm never returned again.